Carolyn Gallagher. I've been on the LPA for a while, but this morning I am your new chair for the next year, I guess. So I'd like to call the meeting to order at 9 o'clock. This is the LPA for Bonita Springs, 13 June 2019. Also, I'd like to say that Jeff Maturo, who is one of our members, has an excused absence this morning. And now I think it's time to call the roll.
Sam Vincent.
Here.
John
I didn't get to hear
Petro.
it.
Linda Schwartz.
Here.
Jeff Maturo. Rex Sims.
Here.
Chairwoman Gallagher.
Here. So we have a quorum. Okay, I would like to begin with the first ordinance. And do we have somebody to read that, Deb?
Charlie.
Does that fall to you, John? No.
Not normally.
The first one is in addition to the Bonita Springs Land Development Code, Chapter 4 zoning, creating a new division of supplementary district regulations to require certain criteria for golf course redevelopment plan developments, providing for conflicts of law, severability, codification, scrivener's errors, inclusion in code, and an effective date.
Thank you.
And Madam Chairman,
Yes.
this is an ordinance that was created at the request of City Council. And what we have done is there was a few golf courses that looked like there may be redevelopment occurring on them. There still may be redevelopment on golf courses. And as a result, the council had asked, after several presentations, to create an ordinance to orderly transition a golf course from the golf course use to another use. We held 2 public hearings or workshops over at Bonita Springs High School and took in numerous mailed-in comments and emailed comments and phone calls to create the draft that you see before you today. And what we've done with this draft is generally try to define what would happen and the process for transitioning a golf course to what we have defined as a residential use. And what was pretty clear at both of our workshops were any new use or any transition of a golf course to another use should be a very low intensity use. There really was not, at least no one had made any comments to me or around me that said they wanted anything other than residential uses for that redeveloped property. And they were also looking at trying as best as possible to incorporate both the design and the scale of the redevelopment to the existing neighborhood with the intent to try to seamlessly blend both of them together. Now, as you read through the document, you'll see that there is a section that buffers the perimeter of the golf course redevelopment area from the adjacent residential or adjacent uses, and there is a pretty wide buffer there. But what we've done is try to keep the grade at its existing level, so that way we prevent the typical condition where there's ponding or additional flooding where somebody puts up a berm or a water management structure where one was not before, and to allow that water to flow as it historically did, either into the site or back onto the adjacent use. So I don't know, this is, at least for me, it feels like we've had numerous conversations about this ordinance. And I know there's been several public conversations about it. Madam Chairman, I'm not exactly sure how you want me to present this particular ordinance. I'm happy to go through it line by line, or we can just take questions and work our way through.
Well, my thought, if everybody agrees, is just to take questions. This is a fairly short one, and if anybody has questions, I had one, but anybody else?
You start out, you're the leader.
Oh, I was just going to let you guys go first. Any questions?
Yes.
Good.
Go ahead.
Oh, well, mine were just general. I was just wondering, the golf course issue is getting to be a pretty large one with many of the golf courses that are in residential areas. Are we talking primarily residential, or more commercial.
When you
And-
talk about Bonita Springs, they tend to be surrounded by residential. In fact,
Yes.
newer the golf course, the greater the opportunity of the surrounding residential area being included as part of an overall planned development. The older the golf course, the less of a chance of that.
Yes. And the other thing is you mentioned, and I think it's pointed to in here, that most of the redevelopment would be housing of some sort?
Yes, ma'am, we would be looking at residential uses. And that type of residential use, we've kind of outlined that needs to be consistent with what the adjacent or nearby existing residential uses are.
Okay, and this thing that says residential accessory uses, what was in your mind, or the city's mind, for that one?
That comes in most of your residential districts, and it basically assumes anything from a detached garage to a pool house. It could be anything other than the principal structure. It would still have to meet setbacks. It would still be governed by the maximum lot coverage, still be covered by the same building code setbacks.
Okay.
It
So
would-
that would include playgrounds?
No, it could, but it would basically be a community playground, not so much on your residential lot playground. So if you had a
Right.
swing set, that would not be covered under here necessarily.
Okay. All right. Any other questions?
Yeah, I also have a question. I see you've addressed the stormwater management study, but I was wondering specifically about the building impacts on surrounding homes. I have friends who live over on Carnoustie Court in Bonita Springs Golf and Country Club, and they have been told by an engineer that any adjacent development in their community could impact the structures of their pools as well as possibly the foundation of their houses. I was just wondering if there's any plan to address something like that if it happens.
I'm not going to tell you something couldn't happen.
Okay.
The possibility of something happen is small. And what we were more concerned with is not so much the impact that you would see from the vibration or construction. It was going to be more the alteration of existing grades, the flow of water. How does water get from wherever it lands into the stormwater structures? Those are the areas that we really focused on, because when you're looking at just infill development, the concerns I think that engineer were outlining were no different than you would see if you were to build a house on Pennsylvania and there were houses on either side of a vacant lot. But what we've really focused at here are, what do we do with the water?
Yeah.
Because
Certainly important.
exactly. And so that's why we've tried to keep a separation of that buffer that we've identified in here. That's why we've looked at any alterations need to be consistent and compatible. If it's within an existing plan development, they still have to meet the standards of that plan development. So we're looking to keep as much of the design and regulations in place as possible and protect those existing houses, because we're all aware whenever you put new development next to older development, the closer it is, the more difficult it is to handle all of those micro issues that you don't really see on a standard engineering plan.
Right. Okay.
Thanks.
I have a question. Some of our existing golf courses go back into the 70s. I think of where I live, Spanish Wells and Bonita Bay and Bonita Golf and Country Club were all done under the old Lee County urban thing. So anything that's done in the future will be to the current standings here. The fact that they were a development order when they were built and so forth is moot now. It will all be under current requirements. The second question I have about it is, everything goes to dwelling units that we're discussing here, but I'm thinking about some of the areas, pickleball seems to be an exciting thing now, and at Cape Coral they have some issues about the noise and so forth. Is that something that would be included here? And likewise, some of the areas may desire to build more substantial health gym type facilities there. And that's not included any place here for additional facilities, sport facilities. Would that be included here?
It would be that if it was, both of those would be recreational uses. One would obviously be interior, one would be exterior. Pickleball, I'll address first, because since it originally came out and we permitted several courts, we've learned a couple of things about the impact that pickleball courts have on adjacent communities. And so we have worked with several communities extensively to mitigate a lot of the sound that you hear emanating from those courts. And not only that, but in the future, where do you place those? How are they oriented towards, an interior development or especially an exterior development? It's very important. So yes, somebody could always ask for any type of recreational activity, whether it's a tennis court, whether it's a roller hockey ring, pickleball, swimming pools. But with each of those comes its own impact, and with each of those impacts comes its own design standards and mitigation strategies. In terms of the gym, that would basically be a clubhouse or recreational facility,
Okay.
and would be permitted the same way.
Okay. Now, the other question I have pertaining to this is we would be changing a great deal of open space, and we discussed the water issues here earlier, and we're going to have a whole lot of roofs and a whole lot of more parking. And I'm wondering if the the additional hard surface conditions that would come with this are going to be, is that a current factor in this development
Yes.
that they would have?
If you would look at item 4 on,
Well, I looked at item 4, I got it, and it's not really,
but then if you look down on page 5 at item 11, it starts talking about the specifics of application. And it says that you have the 40% open space that still must be maintained. And if you turn the page over to page 6, it starts talking about how it applies to planned developments and existing development.
I went under item 4 there, under stormwater management study, and when I got all done, I wasn't sure that it completely addressed it's going to be a substantial increase in anything if there, any kind of housing is going to require hard surface parking and so forth.
Item 4 basically tells you what your standards are, and item 11 tells you how those standards
How you're going to do it. Okay.
Okay. I think that was a good question.
How about maintenance buildings and so forth? All the golf courses have a large area over there for the maintenance building, for the tractors and the mowers and all the equipment. That's going to turn into what?
It could stay as a maintenance building because there's always going to be common area that needs to be maintained. It could be proposed for demolition. It could be repurposed into a different type of building. Those are all options. And they would have to be something that was included in the application for a particular property.
Yeah. Thanks, Rex. Could I say something about Rex's too? I thought they were good comments about the residential accessory uses. And I had made a note when I was reading this originally that perhaps we should put some examples in there that would be allowable, like playground, gym, pickleball. And then I was just wondering, do those uses then, do they come under the other regulations pertaining to the property in the city automatically? Or do you have to address like the noise from pickleball or so on separately in this?
If it's not specifically addressed in this ordinance, the ordinance or whatever standard is already in the land development code would apply.
Okay, would apply. Okay, thank you. Sam?
Everything that we're discussing here, I'm sorry, let me add a real quick question. Everything that we're discussing here is already essentially a gated community because we've restricted any additional fences and so forth. So,
Yes, but not every golf course was within a gated community. I mean, Bonita Springs Golf and Country Club
yes.
is not a gated community, but I think that really is one of the exceptions.
that's the only one.
Most of the other ones, I think you're exactly right, are all within developments.
So if they did a development inside there, it would just have to be inside the gated community. It couldn't be a separate, because you're specific about having no additional fences and so forth.
Correct. Correct.
Okay. Sam?
John, do you know how many old golf courses or golf courses would be affected by this?
All of them.
Well,
The reason why I say all of them is because while there's been 2 golf courses that have been the main topic of conversations, with Bonita Fairways and Bonita Springs Golf and Country Club, this wasn't written for either of them. This was written for any golf course that may want to transition to a different use. And really what I would see, while those two may have more significant redevelopment at some point in the future, the other golf courses would have portions of the golf. If they had 27 holes of golf, maybe 9 holes is transitioned to a residential use. So you wouldn't see the entire golf course redeveloped, but you would see a portion of it. So that's what I would see for most of them.
Right, because I think most of these require payments, or you have to join as a member. Therefore, you go to a vote. But if we could look at a broader look at the scope of this, can you talk about the process that would take place with, say, either one of those golf courses from a city standpoint? In other words, take us through a process of what the city looks at when you come in for an application like that.
Sure. You would be going through the same plan development process as any other rezoning, so you would have your public information meetings before and after sufficiency.
Right.
But in terms of the design and the evaluation of the plan itself, really what we're going to be looking at is how you have designed the redevelopment area to work within that existing development, just as a general statement. And that means how have your road networks been designed? Where are you planning to have your residential units built? How are they going to relate to that existing development, both in terms of the type of residential and the scale of that residential? How are you going to be handling your stormwater design is probably going to be one of the most important things, along with open space. Because a lot of these, as you said, were approved as one project, which had a minimum standard for open space. Most of that open space in those communities was met through the provision of the golf course. So if a portion of that golf course is redeveloped, what do you do to maintain that open space?
Okay.
And additionally, if an entire golf course is used and only a portion of that site is used for redevelopment or residential units, we try to address what needs to be done with the remainder of that property in terms of both design and maintenance here, so that way it's not just left fallow, essentially.
Okay, so the public has input through these neighborhood meetings first, a couple of them, and then it goes,
The zoning board?
right, zoning board, and I guess after that, the public still can have input when it actually goes before the council. Now, is this via a special exception?
This would be through a rezoning to a planned development.
Okay.
Through an amendment or a new application.
Okay, so the public gets a lot of involvement or input,
Yes.
and
And just like any other application, the
Yeah.
public does call our office, send emails, letters to our office, and those are included in the review as well.
the actual safety net for most of this stuff falls with your staff, because as we know with public meetings, not everyone that's impacted shows up.
Correct.
Therefore, only a limited few are left to ask the questions that might impact that particular community. One of the things that I look at as an architect really is what is the impact to structures around earth-moving equipment, and then if there has to be any pile driving. So this involves geology. And so when you begin taking a look at that, and I had a recent case a couple of years ago with that, pile driving, and how does the city regulate those kind of activities on site or sites?
Pile driving hasn't been the most significant issue we've had. Mainly it's been the compaction with the rollers. It's been more of an impact on adjacent residential uses. And for those situations, most of the time it's either turn off the vibration and water the soil and then roll without the vibration.
Well, in my experience, though, I was doing a residence, and of course this is along the Imperial, and I didn't have city input at that point about how the impact of that neighbor would be. In other words, it's something that we agreed to do to control, the vibration. So for all of these owners out there who are, and we talked about an engineer that had a problem, how do we ensure that those sorts of things are looked at in the planning stages?
Noise, dust, and vibration are things that we are specifically authorized to control
Okay.
for that purpose. And we have conditions in place for our approvals that if something causes noise, dust, or vibration after an approval, we still have the ability to address it during construction or at some point in the future. So
Right.
even if it's not caught at the planning stage, we still have the ability to address it during the construction phase.
Yeah, I guess the reason I'm mentioning all of this is so that the public begins to understand in this process, there are a number of safety nets, even after construction starts, that there is some control via the community development.
Yes, and that was one of the main concerns that I think came out during both of the workshops, was people were concerned that all of a sudden they've gone from having a golf course in their backyard to having an open field,
Right.
then the possibility of having redevelopment and construction equipment. And so one of the thoughts that we had when we were putting this together was, what do you do with that construction, and how do you place that construction so that it's not negatively impacting those adjacent residents?
Right. Would any of this future development, it might include multifamily?
It might, but what we try to do is put a standard in place that says proposed residential uses need to be consistent and compatible with adjacent residential uses. And the purpose of that was multifamily can go next to multifamily. Ideally, single family would go next to single family. There's not always going to be a case where it's like for like, but if you're going to put multifamily next to single family, it needs to be maybe 2 stories or a much lesser scale than like a mid-rise building.
I was wondering about that because most gated communities have, multifamily within it. Now, in the planning of that, typically they're placed at the front because of the traffic that's involved with it. And that's probably what we would be looking at if multifamily goes in, so the homeowners know that, for example, a golf course winds itself through subdivisions. And that's going to be the difficulty there, is that you're going to could have multifamily in many different spots if a whole course is done, or even if a portion is done. It may be back of the subdivision.
Correct, and it really does turn into a situation of just maximizing the possibilities while reducing the negative impacts, because if only a small portion of a golf course is appropriate for redevelopment, and that's the portion that someone proposes 2 or 3 story multifamily buildings, and the rest of that's going to be maintained as internal parks or open space, some type of open space use, how do you handle the traffic?
Right.
Because you are gaining a benefit of isolating those units away from most of the existing residential, so they are not visually impacted. But there are other impacts, like you said. What do you do with the traffic? How are you going to handle?
The other thing I might bring out, this is getting long, but there are a lot of points to this when you look at small development or large, is property values, adjacent property values. If you build a multifamily back in a subdivision, multifamily has a history of selling down. Means it goes from a developer who has some great ideas to ones who don't have great ideas, and it starts to get run down. And as a homeowner, I would be worried about the same thing, is that how can we maintain property values when something like that is built? That's hard to do because you can't predict the future. And so what I caution is that when you look at these things, that's one of the primary things that you would look at is the ownership of the development company, and what are their plans, and how does the city hold these developers of multifamily projects to a time frame. In other words, you can't sell within 5 years. You can't sell within 10 years. These are just examples. But we don't have anything right now, I don't think any city does, that limits the time frame for which a developer has to hold on to a piece of property.
No, we don't, and it starts getting into a very delicate
Yes.
area. If there are, we'll take a look to see what is available. I just don't think there's going to be a number of options that we're going to be able to, in terms of duration of ownership or type of ownership, because I know we specifically avoid type of ownership in our regulations.
Yes,
I don't know if we can address duration of ownership.
Yeah, and the reason I say that again is because so many people don't go to public meetings. And what they find themselves in later, they didn't attend, they didn't have a chance to voice this, is that who do they turn to then to stop degradation, of their property values and their property itself, whether through maintenance or just general downgrading of with multifamily, anyone can buy a unit, and it could even go to apartments, which apartment livers don't have skin in the game, so to speak, with where they live. They only be there 6 months or a year or so, then they're gone. That's when projects start to sell down. So I'm just looking for a way that the city can vet these projects early enough on to enough people to where we get maybe not a majority, but more than a minority that are kind of looking at these things. You know?
No problems with that.
Sure.
Along those same lines that Sam brought up, it's a foregone conclusion the price of the dirt is going to be so high that single family is not going to be feasible. You're going to have to build some kind of multifamily, multi-story complex on this piece of dirt to make it economically feasible to buy it in the first place. So what Sam is saying is exactly what will fall in here, because nobody's going to buy it and build single-family houses on it because the dirt's going to be too expensive.
I don't know if I would agree with that. Discussions that we've had, the more specific the discussion, the more single-family that's been proposed. And I would think that if this happens in multiple communities, there would be multifamily proposed at least once. But in the conversations we've had to date, most of the conversations have involved single family. So I don't know if it's, I haven't been involved in the purchase contract, so I can't tell you what they're looking at in terms of price for the land, but I can tell you that evidently it works with whatever single family that has gone through their pro forma, because that's what's been discussed with us.
Well, I think along those lines, a lot of this is going to depend on the planning process, how good the planner is in terms of the integration of different uses. I know they're in Paradise, for example. You have all residential down that way, but you do have a multifamily group that's in this. I think it's condos right on Paradise. That's okay because it's one, and there's one drive in, one drive out sort of a thing. And that's not necessarily buried in that subdivision. You have a golf course in there, it used to be, and sooner or later that will be built out.
But really, I think it has depended more upon the developer than anything else.
Yes.
The developers generally have their style and their type of development they're comfortable with. They've worked on their efficiencies so they can deliver a product, and that's what they generally propose. People that have talked to us about different golf courses, obviously none of them have gone all the way through the approval process, but the discussions we've had have been with people that wanted to build single-family projects.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think I kind of agree that when the property gets very expensive, it's hard for a single house. If you're breaking it up into lots, that's different, but if you have masses, pieces of property, if a developer buys 5 acres, for example, well, I think you're right, Rex, with this, he's got to make a profit on this. It's got to be beneficial. Multifamily goes up.
Yeah, and it's going to depend upon the golf course itself. How was the golf course designed? If you have a golf course that was basically built with parallel fairways and large developable tracks, and I think that you have a greater chance of single family. If you have a golf course that was generally more of an out and in course, fairways are not generally parallel to each other, you have a lot more of a limited area to develop, and it becomes a lot more restrictive.
Yeah. I guess, homeowners would be asking that, you take a hard look at these sort of developments, and I know you would. That's your job, and you do a good job with it. So in that planning process is where it really comes to fruition.
Correct. And that's going to be the trick.
Okay. Any more comments? Okay. Do we want to consider this? Are we ready? Yes. Are there any public comments? Thank you.
I have a handout for you.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there two there? Here's the next one. Okay. Good morning.
Good morning. My name is Don Griffin. I'm the president of the Bonita Fairways Community Association. We're essentially the development that is around the Bonita Fairways Golf Course. And I'm speaking to you here today to tell you our concept, and having read through this in great detail, of how it might affect us and what we would like to see perhaps added to it. Basically, our goal here is to tighten up the language in the proposal. And first of all, I want to say to John and his team that they've done a really good job of letting the public know about what's going on with the process and doing an excellent job of writing this first draft. But my goal here today is to help you to just think about tightening up the language just a little bit, so that when a developer starts looking at this, they can't go beyond what was the intent. So the first word we come across is mitigate. And we'd like to see that prevent negative impacts as opposed to mitigate them. Compatible.
Where are we on here?
If you just kind of follow through in there, you'll see the highlight word is in yellow, and the red comments are what we had put in for it. Okay, this is just a summary because we only have 3 minutes to kind of get through this. Okay, so when we use the word compatible, we'd like to see that in use, architectural style, stories, size, density, and height. We use the word limited scale. We'd like to see that lower density than currently. Massing is sort of a new word, and we see that as the same as density, and would like to keep that at the word density. Redevelopment includes the word portion, okay? And for us, that's a concern. We'd like to see it deleted. This could allow our 10 acres in Bonita Fairways Golf Course to be redeveloped, essentially cutting out that one parcel and then leaving the rest vacant, which would be a real negative impact for us. The development pattern, we'd like to make sure that when we talk about a development pattern, it's within the existing planned development. It's not the development of the entire, everything we would see on West Terry Street. Golf course boundary, again, I understand the original intent there, but in Bonita Fairways, we have 9 distinct separate parcels that are the golf course, and each one of those parcels has a boundary around it. So we'd like to see the boundary be around the individual parcels and not just the perimeter of the entire 184 acres. Also concerning about definitions of key terms, maintenance, it was designed to be done monthly, and in our estimation, it should be done at a minimum of weekly, and it should be irrigation. I know that's a city standard to say that it only has to be cut once a month, but if you have a golf course fairway that has gone fallow and it's only cut it once a month, you got a foot of grass out there. Plan development amendment. So if a portion of the golf course is cut out and made a target of amendment, it leaves the rest of the golf course in a state of limbo, which could be abandoned, which is a concern. Discontinuance of golf course operations. And we're not sure what this was intended to reach, but it doesn't appear here because our whole goal here is to repurpose a golf course and not to abandon it. Stormwater management study, we want that to be performed by an independent licensed company selected by the city as opposed by the developer. Okay. Moving right along here, maximum height 35 feet. City Council may grant a deviation to 50 feet based on this new term mass, and we'd like to see that go back to the word density. And we want that new buildings that are going up to be similar in height to the ones that are around it. Minimum open space, 40%. Just want to make sure we get the terms here. 40% open space is the calculation of 40% times the total number of acres in the original planned development. It should not be 40% of the golf course cut-out section. In our case, we have 184 acres of land right now. Golf course is 75 acres, and that 75 acres is primarily the amount of open space required to meet the 184 acre goal. If we now say, okay, the 75 acres is going to be cut out and redeveloped, now you only have to have 40% of that. What that does is it just increases density in the entire community. Goal here, 75% of all required open space shall be green or landscaped areas. This must be 100% because we don't know what that other 25% is. It could be paved roads, it could be parking lots, it could be garages, okay? So we say that the 40% should be a hard number. We don't want that to be softened up by saying that we can take these parking lots and count that as open space. That's not going to help the flood issues, okay? The entity responsible for the maintenance, there should be some protection in the event of developer bankruptcy, such as a completion bond for a stated period, say 5 years. Also, there needs to be a chain of responsibility, such as the developer first, then the newly created association, and it must be part of their declaration. The concern here is that the developer will say, yeah, we're going to maintain this, and they come through and they do all of the development, and then they go bankrupt and they clear out, and we're left with all of the grass that needs to be cut and no maintenance budget to take care of it. And then soft language, we're coming to the close here. The last sections deal with deviations from the established redevelopment regulations. We talk about negotiations, adverse deviations, negative impact on abutting neighborhoods, developers' bona fide need for deviation in exchange for significant enhancements. And would like to see the language stated that the affected neighborhoods would have a say in the negotiations involving those adverse deviations if they were going to be discussed. And that's everything that I had to say. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Any other people who would like to comment?
Just as a quick point, most of those items from requiring bonds to establishing authority are already in different places of the Land Development Code and have already been addressed. In terms of the 25% open space that was not grassed, impervious space does not count as open space. A parking lot, driveway, those things that are made of concrete, asphalt, those don't count as open space. Brick pavers may. If you have a deck or open area with brick pavers, that would count as open space. Those could go towards that 25%. But anything that does not allow water to penetrate the surface would not be considered open space. And also, massing is not the same as density, and those two terms should not be confused.
John, as I'm thinking about this, in these types of developments, you may end up having zero lot line.
You may.
You may.
You may not, but you may.
You may. I know I lived in one in Brendan Cove. You have a zero lot line, but it was well done, and the streets were attractive. They weren't straight; they were curved, and there are a lot of things the developer did that were good, and I'm sure that would be looked at in the planning process.
Yes.
I mean, you can't. It's hard to react to something that doesn't exist right now, unless you're a planner yourself.
Yeah, and we do regularly have conversations with the adjacent public
Right.
before applications are ever brought to public hearings. So the idea that the public would not be invited to comment both to us directly and at public hearings, that situation doesn't exist. So I don't want anyone to start to think that would be the case.
Yeah, I think that's always been the case here. We try to bring all this stuff forward. But is this golf course, is Bonita Fairways up for sale? Or a portion thereof?
I've heard there have been discussions. I have not been a part of those discussions, nor have I been presented a contract. But I would not be surprised because I've heard more than one person say that it is.
Really? Interesting.
Now, that is nothing but rumor.
Yeah.
So you take that as with a
Most of the houses in that area there are single family small, right? There are no
It's a
real
mix.
big ones. It's a mix.
It's a mix of everything from mobile homes to single family to multifamily.
Right.
Interesting. I just was going to comment on Don's 40%, because you actually said it, that the 40% is based on the community rather than
Correct.
just the golf course acreage, and those are two different things,
They are, and
two different 40%.
you also have to understand that not every golf course is approved the same way. Bonita Springs Golf and Country Club is not the same as Bonita Fairways. And those are the two, like I said, that we've mainly focused on, although they're definitely not the only two that this applies. Bonita Springs Golf and Country Club was a separate standalone golf course. So any redevelopment on there would be 40% of the golf course area, because that was what was considered the project boundary. Bonita Fairways included the surrounding residential areas. That would be 40% of the overall project. So you really have to understand how that particular golf course was approved to understand what is going to be the 40% that's applied.
And that's better. But I don't remember seeing, when I was reading it, being able to see something that I interpreted that way. So,
John, has staff reviewed this handout we just received?
No, this is the first time I've looked at it.
First time?
A lot of the comments, this is not the first time we have been in the same room.
Okay.
I've seen more than one PowerPoint and had more than one discussion. So some of the items are issues that we've discussed before, and that's why I just wanted to make a quick point
Okay.
on several of them, that if a lot of the discussion points are included in separate sections of the Land Development Code. So it's just because they are not in the document before you does not mean that they were not addressed or not considered serious.
Do they need to be referred to in here?
No,
To a
ma'am.
particular
No,
place
ma'am.
in the land development code?
There's no need at this point.
Okay,
In terms of some of the other, there were a few comments that are specifically related to the draft that we've not gone over, and we'll take a look. If there's something that makes sense and that would make for a better project, we're more than happy to include it. We have no pride of authorship.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that's all that you were asking for, is that community development take a look at tightening the language, which you say that you're going to be doing.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for bringing this forth.
yes. So how do we want to handle this? Do we just want to make them, I guess we're done, no more comments.
Well, I don't know if the public was done, but
Nobody raised their hand when I asked the second time. Okay, come on up.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Bev Ponchak, and I'm a resident at Bonita Fairways. And John, you mentioned that there was a difference between the word mass and density, and I would like to better understand what that is.
density addresses the number of units per acre, where massing deals with a particular building itself or structure itself. So one single-family house per acre can be one single-family house per acre, but the size of that house is what deals with the massing. Does that meet with your satisfaction?
That does. Particularly when you talk about multifamily. I think we have one more person come up.
One more person.
I can ask a question.
Sure.
I'm Dwight Essman. I live right across the street from the Bonita Springs Golf and Country Club. The stormwater management study, I've heard things like, is it 25-year or 50-year, or what? What's the stormwater?
There's several different calculations, and in fact, we're revising how people are going to be submitting that study through a new modeling software. So we are located within the South Florida Water Management District, which generally deals with a 100-year storm, and within that, there are standards for roadways and parking lots, standards for houses, and also standards for berms and other water management structures. That starts with a pre-development condition versus a post-development condition. Then you add the City of Bonita Springs standard, which is an additional 50% of that area for water quality, not for volume, but for quality. And all of that goes into a design that is reviewed by us for the math and for the general design. It's also approved. Anything over 2 acres of impervious space or 10 acres of general area goes to the South Florida Water Management District, and they also issue a separate permit. So there are multiple people looking at multiple things. So it's, when you say which standard is it, generally it's all of them. And for different types of structures or for different projects and different, it could be in a flood zone, floodway, all of them have their specific standards. And so there is more than one standard, and there is generally more than one reviewing entity taking a look at how the design works.
Then I'll be blunt. Would you be confident with this right here, that if we had the summer of 2017, that there would be no additional flooding from our golf course? I
I
mean,
will start off by, I am not the one you want checking the math.
okay.
And I'll add to that with the fact that right now, I agree with what was presented by Jim Beaver when he was commissioned by the city to perform the study that says, you will never create a situation where there is no possibility of flooding. And I think that exists. What you do is you look to mitigate the stormwater, move it away from the areas where it's going to have a negative impact into areas where it doesn't have a negative impact as fast as possible. And you, in that process, you also need to be treating the quality of that water. So I think that this moves us in a direction that addresses a lot of the issues where you see with infill development. And those generally tend to be, what do you do when you build a new water management system or a new house next to an older community? And generally, the older community gets water backed up on it, or at least it does in places, maybe not as a general rule, but there are locations where there's ponding or there's stagnant water where there wasn't before. That's why we try to put in some standards that allow for easing into a newer development where you don't change the grading. You wouldn't be putting in some sort of a structure or changing the land in a way that's going to allow most of those issues to occur. I think that the city's probably going to be in better shape once it starts requiring this modeling information, because we'll have a better feel and better knowledge of what's going to happen under specific situations. But if you're asking me, will we ever prevent additional flooding, and I will say that there is always a possibility of flooding based upon a single event or a series of events.
So I think you're saying that you feel like this is about as far as you can go to, without taking the property rights away.
Yes.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask
Is-
a question.
I'm gonna-
Ms. Chairman, can you tell us what our goals are here today? What are we to do
With this one?
with that?
Well, that was a little unclear. I was just thinking, we always look at things whether they're compatible with a comprehensive land use plan.
Correct.
And this is a little different, I think,
They're all,
but it's still, yeah.
But the charge is the same. Your
Yes.
main goal for all ordinances that come in for land development code amendments is to determine whether they're consistent and compatible with the comprehensive plan. That way, we're not implementing or bringing language to the city council that has inconsistencies. So that is your first goal. Now, I know in the past, several members have had additional concerns outside of that charge and have wanted different comments presented to the council as a separate motion. And we've done that. But those are not specifically your areas of responsibility, but you do think about these things and you live in this community and your comments are just as valid as anybody else's. So we have brought those comments to the council as a separate motion, saying, yes, it was compatible, but there were concerns in these areas.
Okay, all right.
I would make a motion if you're ready.
Okay, I am ready. Go ahead.
Well, while this is a work in progress, and I'm quite sure that it's not completed, as it will be sometime in the future, as it is presented to us today, I see no reason why it's in conflict with any portion of the comp plan. And so therefore, I would make a motion that we accept it.
Okay,
I'll second that motion.
okay. Everybody, comments? Okay.
Is it, or would it be proper to say that this motion could include that this document be passed on as part of the recommendation to the city council, that this will be taken upon community development to look at and to tighten language where they can as part of this approval or motion?
We are going to take a look at this. I don't know if you want to include that as part of the motion.
That's what I'm wondering.
Do it.
Uh,
That's not an issue. In terms of
Right.
the presentation to the council, I'm sure that there'll be someone there to present this to them. But
Yeah.
we will have taken a look at this prior to their.
Actually, there's nothing in this handout that is really in conflict with comp plan.
Right.
No, it's not.
So while it's an important addition, it in itself does not render the ordinance here not in compliance. So I think that
I agree.
to add that might confuse the
Okay.
issue.
Okay,
Just,
well,
I would simply state that you might want to condition that to say, based upon a very quick review and without any analysis, you have determined that there are a couple things in there that would concern me if they were included, but most of what's there.
okay.
Yeah, I would figure you'd look at things that you could appropriately do, things that you cannot do.
Okay,
So-
Rex, do you want,
It was seconded. We had discussion.
Motion made.
okay, you're finished. Okay,
Vote.
everybody ready?
Yeah.
Linda?
Yay.
Did you want to call? Okay,
Sam Vincent,
Yes.
Chairman Gallagher,
yes.
Linda Schwartz,
Yes.
Rick Sims.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Now we move on.
Well, now we're warmed up.
Yeah, we need to, do we want to, just a question about, administrative question. Do we want to do the other short one first and then leave the long one till last?
That's up to you.
Or does anybody need to run to the bathroom or whatever before we do this one, this long 97-page one?
Well, don't let the 97 pages fool you. That's also, most of that is strike-through old language.
It is, that's true.
We've done this whole thing 2 years ago. in Great minute detail.
So we just continue on in the order that it's presented. Okay, that's fine. Would you read it for us, please?
Item 3B, the title block reads, "An addition to the Bonita Springs Land Development Code, Chapter 3, Development Standards, creating a new section under Article 5, Division 2, the Bonita Beach Road Design Standards, Chapter 4, Zoning, Article 5, Division 10, creating a new division of supplementary district regulations, establishing criteria for development and redevelopment along the Bonita Beach Road corridor, amending Chapter 4 zoning, Article 5, Divisions 5, 6, 7, and 8, the use tables, amending Chapter 4 zoning, Article 3, Division 1, plan development, providing for conflicts of law, severability, codification, scrivener's errors, inclusion in code, and an effective date."
Okay, thank you. Okay,
I have been joined by several friends because this is a little bit longer, and we've all had a piece
Okay.
of this proposed ordinance. This is one of the original pieces of legislation from the city and one of their main priorities, going back to just post-incorporation, in terms of how Bonita Beach Road is handled. And it's been a hot topic prior to and even today as to how development takes place. Original thought, there were two, well, let me take a step back. There were two original thoughts. One was that it would be a grand boulevard, things would be set back, think Paris. Then there was another thought that buildings would be brought closer to the roadway, more of a small town type charm, more urban. And really what we did was kind of have almost a very uncomfortable mixture of the two for a number of years. City Council commissioned a study from Tool Design to take a look at the roadways and the road itself. That study showed that there should be basically essentially a reconstruction of the road, lanes being moved, the travel lanes being reduced in width, a multi-use path and a sidewalk installed, mostly on the south side of the roadway. And then the buildings would be generally designed closer to the road, more of an urban feel. There'd be a lot more pedestrian and multimodal access to both the sidewalk and the path. And we would be designing not just for pedestrians and cyclists as an afterthought, but they would be essentially equally part of the design for not only the roads, but how each of those buildings relates to the road. The city then commissioned DPZ Co-Design to come up with more of a land use study. And they had a slightly different thought, but there were a lot of consistencies. They focused more of the urban thought and design on nodes, generally those intersections of moderate to major streets. And in between there, they thought maybe less of an urban form should take place. So we were then asked to combine the best aspects of both of those into a document that would be the new Bonita Beach Road overlay, and to create a new standard for the development redevelopment. And what we've tried to do is focus on establishing separate zones because Bonita Beach Road, being a very long roadway, has different character in different portions. That was generally identified in the tool study, and then generally more confined during the DPZ study. So we've taken the tool study zone and also taken several of the of the nodes that DPZ has proposed and try to incorporate those into a single document. And so with this, even though it's not the entire 97 pages, it's more about 30 pages. Madam Chairman, if you're okay, if we want to go page by page, and that way if there are questions, if there's conversation, we can kind of keep it somewhat organized.
I'm thinking that might be the best way to do it.
And if we change our minds halfway through, then we can do it different.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so, yeah, I think we'll start there. So
Okay.
maybe start on page 3.
Yes, ma'am. If you look at page 3,
Bottom.
there's 2 Land Development Code chapters that this will impact. What you're looking at before you on page 3 is in chapter 3, which is generally development standards. That goes into road cross-sections, engineering standards, landscaping, the like, and that's where we start to define the zones. Those zones are directly transcribed from the tool design study, and there will be a map that's included that shows the boundaries of each of those. As you get on,
I would add something
yes, sir.
to your comment there. In the beach zone, the significance of it is half of that beach zone is in Carter County.
Not on our map, because we only included the north portion of the roadway.
Well, okay,
Correct.
but I say
Yes,
the
sir.
actual development that we're looking at,
Past Vanderbilt
the
Road,
first half mile of it or so is
Collier County.
in Carter County. Okay.
Yes, sir. We do need to insert the beach zone cross-section, but just as a heads up to everyone, we aren't looking to make any changes out there. The beach zone is the beach zone is the beach zone. There's residential uses. There's a handful of commercial uses along the Bonita Beach Road portion of it, but we're not looking to alter what they are. We're not looking to tinker with the residential character of Hickory Boulevard. That stays as is. So anything that's added from a documentation standpoint would simply be to reaffirm the existing condition. We get into the commercial zone and historic zone, and what you'll see is all of those are showing, if you look at underneath the cross-section itself, it'll give you distances and measurements. Those travel lanes will be reduced to 11 feet, and then you'll see a 10-foot multi-use path and a 6-foot sidewalk located in all of these. And that stays pretty consistent all the way through. Once you get up to the eastern portion of the site, basically east of Bonita Grand, you get into the community zone. And the community zone is going to be treated very much like the beach zone. It is existing development that is this area is a little bit different. In fact, it's generally controlled by planned development zoning. And we are not looking to transition, transform, or redevelop that area away from how it's been approved.
It's called the interstate zone.
The community zone is the portion that's out the very east, from Bonita Grand to the very end of Bonita Beach Road. The interstate zone is around I-75.
Okay, because what I'm looking at here is we got interstate zone, commercial, historic, and beach.
Page 8.
John, just,
Oh, sorry, what the page? Yeah. Oh, you're
If
the
you look at
map.
page 9,
If you look at page 8, there is a map.
okay.
yeah. John, just real quick, and I may be looking at this wrong, but I'm looking at your pictures with your measurements of the different zones. How are they supposed to come together when you have one road that's 150 feet wide and another that's 109?
What you're looking at is going to take the
200.
reconstruction of Bonita Beach Road.
Say
So
again?
What you're looking at will take a reconstruction of Bonita Beach Road within the existing right-of-way. So for this to become reality and transition from one zone to another will be the job of the designing engineer. And fortunately, not a job for us today.
It seems like there will be businesses and land that will be changed, won't there? Moved,
What was
where the road would be widened or not? No?
What was specifically requested when Tool Design came up with these cross-sections was that they would work within the existing right-of-way. So this does not assume additional right-of-way takings.
So you can assume that the 200-foot width in the community zone
Exists.
exists for all of the other zones too?
No, ma'am.
No.
The
I'm
right-of-way
not
width,
getting it.
the right-of-way width for Bonita Beach Road is not static from the very east end to the west end. It does vary. Those variations in right-of-way width are reflected in the cross-sections that you're looking at. So what is on the ground and what is under ownership of, well, Lee County Department of Transportation is reflected in these cross-sections
So it's up to the contractor or designer or whoever
to make
to
those
make
work.
the transitions.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay,
That's why they have a license.
thank you. That's hard.
So those cross-sections go through page 6, and then we start getting into the standards on page 7.
I have a
This
question
starts-
on page 7.
Yes, go ahead.
Pardon me. The exceptions down there. I was quite disturbed here a while back about the development where they wanted to expand the project out in front of Hunter's Ridge, and there was some issues came up because it was designed under a previous design and approved under a previous design, and the question came up about changing it to the current design. Does this exception keep things like that from happening?
It defines what happens when. And what I'll tell you is there are several sections in this proposed ordinance that we feel very comfortable with, but are areas that need to be discussed by both you and the city council. Because while we have defined what areas and when they need to come into compliance and what does compliance mean, this is the staff's proposal. And somebody else could have a much different feeling as to how this ordinance should apply to existing developments. So if you have a differing viewpoint, that is definitely something that we could take under consideration or could be included in the draft ordinance.
I didn't interpret that as a yes or no. I didn't get it, John.
If you'd like, real quick, what we did, and this is, as John said, something for discussion. There's a provision there that if you have achieved a certain amount of completion, then you're basically grandfathered into that old standard. But there's a percentage in there that if you're between this percent, 50% and 80%, that you got a 3-year period to claim that, because we don't want somebody 20 years from now when everybody else is redeveloping saying, well, wait a second, I want to go back out here, when the idea of all these ordinances is to encourage redevelopment to come in compliance with the plan. And so there's a time limit on that. And then if you've got a PD that's been sitting there for 10 or 15 years, you've never done anything with it, you need to come in compliance with the plan now.
But we have people come here every time when they're doing something, and they sit here and claim vested rights.
And this is an attempt, whether it's a good attempt or a bad attempt, can be debated, but it is an attempt to solve that issue.
And to answer your question, if you're discussing Horizon Park, there was no development on that property, and so they would have to come into compliance. If you're talking about Burnwood, which then now South Links, most of that project was previously developed, so it would fall under a different standard. I'd have to see what the percentage was to see where it would fall here, but they would be treated differently because one site was completely vacant and the other one had existing.
Well, I look at areas along there that are underutilized presently. They have I think of Palm River Mobile Home Park there. I mean, ultimately, sometime in the future, that dirt's going to be quite a bit more valuable than the use is there now, but yet it would have a certain grandfathered right there.
You've identified, once again, the one use that has specific regulations associated with it. And mobile home parks are not supposed to be expanded and no new parks to be approved. So that's probably not a one-for-one conversion like if you were to look at maybe a self-storage facility or maybe an underutilized commercial building. So I understand your point, but there are probably different examples out there that would better talk about redevelopment.
Right.
Okay, continue, page 8.
Okay, page 8. This gives you the remaining definitions and standards for existing projects. It gets into the map that visually depicts those zones that we have just talked about. And then we start talking on page 9 about use districts. Now, this is something that we do want your input, and we do want city council's input. What, Bonita Beach Road has always had a note within the existing zoning tables. And those notes say for property, for particular uses, it would say for property under 1 acre, it was a special exception. For property over 1 acre was a planned development required for approval. It also had standards that said you couldn't have drive-throughs visible and et cetera, but the uses were always handled by a note. This creates a new table. This does not exist in your land development code right now, and what we have done is created 4 different use districts for Bonita Beach Road. You could go as high as having a specific use table for each district. You could go as low as having 1 or 2 use tables if you choose to do use tables at all, and go away from the note that you currently have. That is entirely up to you. But what we've done is we've tried to focus on the input that we've had from council and also our consultants from a land use perspective, saying what land uses should be there and what uses should generally be discouraged from locating on Bonita Beach Road. And we try to have that reflected in these tables. So probably the first order of business is the macro look at this and whether you think these tables are a good idea or a bad idea. If they're a bad idea, we don't need to go any further. We can go about fixing
I
it.
have a question on that, though.
Ma'am.
If it's not included here, does that automatically mean no?
Yes.
Not included means no. Okay,
Correct.
so there are no other uses at all that could be done unless it's mentioned on this table,
Yes, ma'am.
right?
That's the way it's proposed.
I'd like to say this, I
I don't-
like the way you've done this because I think it brings some structure to something that could be quite complicated when you start comparing one zone to another. So you're making the uses applicable in that zone, where this zone may not include some of those. I think it's a great way to do it, John.
I have a quick comment and question. P stands for permitted, or, okay, and SE for special exception.
Yes,
I noticed that community zone is not in this table. Is there any reason it's not included? Is it because it's
Yes.
built out?
It's just like the beat, well, almost every property in the community zone has been approved as a planned development
Okay,
and has a specific schedule of uses associated with those approvals. And what we're not looking to do is impact those previous approvals with this document.
okay.
But that's why.
Okay.
We had also outlined that on page 8 under one of the exemptions where it says all planned developments in the community zone,
Okay.
which really that's what they all are zoned essentially.
Okay.
Okay.
Without going through this line by line, where do I find electric car recharging stations?
That'd be an accessory use. That
Is
would,
it permitted every place?
I don't think that we have necessarily regulated electric charging stations. We have them located at certain gas stations, and they've always, at least the proposals we've seen within the city have always kind of gone on together. But I know that Gulf Coast Town Center has charging stations.
Most hotels and office buildings are now including that as part of the,
Unless I would be instructed to do otherwise, I would look at that as just an accessory use, that as long as it met different development and
just like the sprinkler
standards.
system.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Unless involved a quantity that causes parking and traffic to be a problem. You know, we might want to have 30 of these or 50 charging stations. Now we talk about parking.
Jackie is pulling up something that,
We consider those essential service facilities group 1, which is your typical
Essential.
utilities of a certain size. So I don't believe that is
When the
adversely-
first person comes in and has one on their drawing, I don't want it to be an issue. We're not going to reinvent the wheel here.
it's
It's what
permitted.
page is
permitted
that
by
on?
right in all districts. So it would be handled under Essential Service Facilities Group 1, so on page 13 at the bottom of the table.
So
You'll
that
see
includes car charging.
Yes, ma'am. And we had made that change when Waldrop Engineering had updated our use groups a few years ago.
When we were talking about codes real quick before, administrative codes, you have an AA back here in the back. I didn't know what,
That is administrative approval, so there are certain uses that are processed and reviewed by staff, but not necessarily permitted by right. So we still have the ability to review them, place conditions on them for compatibility or operational aspects.
okay, and I thought I saw another one. Is there another one I missed? The other, the P and the SE are very common. EO,
Existing only.
existing only.
And then too, with a lot of these, the second column, you'll see a lot of different code references or note references, and that just means with those uses, applicants want to go ahead and look at those note sections to see if there's additional regulations that they would need to comply with.
Okay. All right,
can
so,
Jump in. As I look at one of the items, building material sales, that would probably be something like Home Depot. And that's special exception. So under these rules right now, Home Depot would have to come in for a special exception, right? If they want, or Lowe's or one of those people like that.
And they too would possibly fall under the large-scale retail ordinance
Right.
as well, which I know we still have to also see how that fits into the puzzle, because our large-scale retail ordinance is very suburban in nature.
Right.
But if we go ahead and treat the street frontages with liner buildings and things like that, maybe that's a way to deal with it. Otherwise, it's very suburban, large buffers and berms, and I know DPC was not necessarily thought that was the best design practice for the roadway.
Well, I like the fact that building material sales will be special exception. That's a huge animal to deal with. But, you know, when you first go in, you look at a piece of property, you're saying, oh, I can put such and such there. Great return. Well, special exception is a little hoop to jump through. So that's a good location for it. Now, as I look at zero lot line, we're going to have a lot of existing property out there, larger tracts than just a 60-foot wide lot. And then how do we integrate zero lot line with what's existing now? How do you do that?
Do you want to get into that when we get to the property development regulations, or do you want to finish the uses first? I think that we're hoping to look for some guidance on that as well, with the DPZ form-based code that they gave us that we're still reviewing to see how we handle that same issue.
I know, what's difficult for me as I read through this, this probably all meets the comp plan, because comp plans are meant to be flowery kinds of statements about what we want to be. And it's also like planting an oak tree today. And when you look at this development plan, you say, well, in my lifetime, will I ever be able to experience these great ideas? And what I don't see in here is the time frame for what I see on page 23 through 27 here. This is the drawing here, and I've done many of these kinds of drawings. These are utopian kinds of plans, okay? And like I say, all of this would eventually meet the comp plan. But there's nothing talking about how we get there from here with so much existing. These plans deal with, the roads are existing, that's easy. When you start putting buildings on them, it's difficult. And the only thing you can do is offer a utopian plan.
If you want, go ahead.
If I may also, on the note, I think you're talking about the nodes, which starts on page 27, and these came from the DPZ, Bonita Beach Road Land Use Report.
Right.
And really what they attempted to do is you could see the darker shaded buildings represent the existing buildings that are there. And then as infill occurs and redevelopment occurs, how they envision redevelopment to occur. So with the buildings, lining the roadway frontages and things like that. So,
Well, Jackie, it seems like that we have lots of buildings right along Beach Road, lots of property that's developed.
We do. We also have lots of vacant property. There's a real mix.
Is a real mix.
It's at a low
This-
intensity too. I mean, you have to think when we actually run the numbers, a lot of the development, the suburban style development, they're building way below the maximum floor area
Right.
ratio.
Yeah.
So,
It's underutilized is what we're
Correct.
saying. There's a great deal of Beach Road that was built 20, 25 years ago that is completely underutilized for the maximum best use for that property. So that's what we're looking at here. What the dark shaded things that are already existing were good 25 years ago, but they're not going to be there forever because there comes a time where the value of the dirt exceeds the value of the use that you're using for now. So
I guess what I'm talking about, Rex, is that these are good plans. These are good ideas. When will I experience these? Piecemeal or
And that-
it's piecemeal?
It's a short answer, but if you want, part of that answer comes from page 7 when we talked about exceptions. Part of that is going to come when somebody decides to redevelop property. And part of that decision is going to come, as Mr. Sims outlined, when the price of that property exceeds the value of the buildings. Most of what you see out there, and most buildings anywhere, are built based upon the value of the property versus
at the time,
what you're able to sell at the time of the construction. And as things become more and more built out, vacant space becomes more of a commodity, people start looking at redevelopment opportunities because maybe it's cheaper to buy this underutilized site, tear down a building and build a new building. So I would say that the short answer to your question is piecemeal. But I would imagine that the piecemeal is going to take place in certain sections at a time. You know, I'd imagine that if one project comes in, it's probably going to make it easier for surrounding properties to come in and get developed in similar timeframes.
Now, to reach these ideas, though, the people that own the property now, if because of the uses, they could be limited as to what can be located on their property. There's a case on 041 Road that, he can't sell his property because of what DPZ was coming up with the required uses, or how would you say, the desired uses of that property. It limited his market.
We have identified several issues that we've dealt with probably in the past year in this use table. So they're either, one, more clearly defined, so there isn't a question, or two, for those that DPZ has recommended be included that maybe are not included today are in here.
Okay.
And vice versa. Some of them that were previously included have been removed at their direction. So I don't know if there's any more questions through the use table itself. I know it's a lot to take in a short period of time.
I have an administrative question. Like on page 10, I see there's some of these squares, or columns, whatever, squares in the columns that have blanks, and some of them that have dashes. And I thought at first the blanks were just big overarching categories with the ones underneath it that pertained. But there's one over here on page 10 that talks about banks.
That's because if you look underneath banks and financial establishments, it says Group 1. So whenever you have a use that's broken down into different groups, the general use will not have anything listed there. It's going to be the groups where the permitted use.
So it's still an overarching, like, title
Correct.
section? Okay.
Correct. And so you would look at what's permitted under Group 1, and that would tell you.
Okay. Got
And
it.
for those dashes that you're seeing for boat rental, that would mean it's not permitted in those
Right.
districts, but it would be permitted.
Yeah, I got that through most of it, that those were overarching categories where they wanted to discuss pieces of that category. But that one over there kind of confused me, and I think I saw it one other time.
You probably saw it again at the very last one where it says public, and there's a dash in the community zone for a mini warehouse.
Public. All right.
And there's a handful of others in there as well.
And I have another kind of probably dumb administrative question, though. When you addressed the categories in the first, on the first page, beach, commercial, historic, interstate, and community, I would think that when you do the columns on each of these, that you would use that same order, because when people get printouts like we do, there's no way telling what column you're looking at, and from one section to another, the columns change.
That's a formatting issue that needs to,
Can that be fixed?
yes, ma'am. It'll be listed on every page. It's just that what this is, the timing of this prevented some of the formatting.
Nuances and so on, yeah, I understand that. I just wanted to point it out, so maybe that would be helpful. I'm not sure that the word processing programs or whatever can actually put
They do.
headers on things
Each
when they're part of another document without getting those headers everywhere else. I don't,
Yeah, and that's an issue. It's when you're compiling a document, and when we get to the final one, we can restructure it. But when you're compiling a document, it only wants to put headers at the top of the page. And so, but when you do that, then also it puts headers on pages you don't want headers.
right, that was my point.
So, but,
So you couldn't say page 5 to 10, we want the headers, but not.
right, but once we get it to, we can manually adjust it once we get it to a final document.
If we can't figure it out, we'll go find out.
Yeah, and put them in put the categories in the same order so that through the document, you kind of know what you're looking at, that's all.
The only thing that comes to my mind
Excuse me.
about the naming of these sections is when you talk about a historical section, the area that I'm more familiar with, it kind of puts up a red flag that somehow or another there's going to be some additional restrictions in that particular area in the development area.
I do not have any opinions about the names. We have simply
Okay.
stolen those from
Well,
previous studies.
we ran into this when we were building some houses up in Punta Gorda. There is a historical section there, and the design of the house has to fit a certain window opening criteria and so forth and so on. So, but this doesn't
If
include any special design recommendations. And the Shell station on the corner doesn't become a historical building just because it's in a,
no, I think it does in a couple years, but not
Or the donuts.
all right.
Yes,
But I think that needs to be made clear, because when I read this over the other night, first time, first thing went up in my mind was a alarm that there's going to be some kind of special setbacks or design criteria for that historical section.
We can call these zones whatever
Okay.
people want to call them, and I'm happy to change them or leave them the same, whatever the feeling may be. So,
ABC.
but I understand you. I'm fine with ABC. 1, 2, 3. That's fine.
I think a name, though, really is good. It gives some ownership to a zone, and an identity.
And it is a good point. I mean, the historic zone, while it does have some connotations that you've implied, it also references the fact that that's the intersection with Old 41, and that does go to your historic downtown. So it's not without reason. It just maybe not as descriptive as it should be.
Just as long as 6 months from now, we don't have a new thing for the design criteria for the historical district. I mean, I can kind of see that following.
Don't tell all of
Down
our
the road.
plans. All right.
John, as I look at page 17 here under parking lot,
Yes, sir.
and I see special exceptions for commercial. I think I understand why, but this is intended to be that way because of the quantity of parking that's involved with that, right?
Correct. And what they've done is they've kind of identified auto-based uses and
Right.
put additional restrictions on those. And it doesn't get much more auto-based than a commercial parking lot.
I think 19 has a typo. I'm not sure. Down under the restaurants where it has a note, you just have the 40.
Mm.
And I'm not sure what that refers to.
That's a section.
It might be 40-1099 is above, or something.
No, that's
like-
correct.
Huh?
That's correct.
So it should be added under restaurants?
I don't think anything should be added.
Oh, they just have a 40 in parentheses. It
That's
says,
a use activity group reference, so restaurants are under subsection 40 of the
Okay.
use activity groups.
okay, so just 40
But maybe
is-
the parentheses could be removed
Okay,
on the 4, yeah. Thank you,
it just was different, so I thought,
thank you.
all right. I guess we're just going to turn through, and the person who gets the next one.
I'd like to say, this is a difficulty issue, and I think you really brought some order and structure to it that is pretty neat. You know, I really do. It's well done, John.
Well, I can't take any.
Jackie and
There's some talented people that put this together. So.
yes.
Yeah, I was really happy to see that you've incorporated the complete streets concepts here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
As I look on page 24, we have on-street parking, and I guess on the next page it says that's commercial zones only. I had it underlined beach, on-site parking within the beach, but the beach area is not being dealt with right now. Is that right?
Correct.
Because it'd be almost impossible with the current plans or future plans for that.
And actually, before we get to page 24, the very bottom of page 22 talks about block sizes, and that goes a lot with the standards from the tool design group about creating blocks. We have several sections of Bonita Beach Road, the large vacant area, and not only that, but there's also portions that they're looking to redevelop. And for those areas, creating that block was something that was very important as part of that vision. And on page 23, you'll see setbacks and other standards. Now, there's also what was in the tool design study, which I think we'll include here instead of this particular chart, is for each of those zones, there was kind of specific standards for how the building related to the street, both in terms of the setback from the roadway, the width of the sidewalk that went from the building to the path, the width of the landscaping. So there were certain standards that he had for 3 or 4 of those zones that I think we're going to use to replace this particular section.
So you're just going to put in a different table? Is that what you're doing?
It will essentially be multiple tables to serve the same purpose, yes, ma'am. But there'll be a table for either each zone or for a few zones.
So this is going to be treated something like a living document where, you know, make changes as required in the years to come, right?
Yeah,
So you're leaving yourself open to make those changes, right?
there were certain things that we just had to get on paper because we have a moratorium that was expiring. There's certain things
Right.
that are in motion and timelines that need to take place. And so we were trying to get a document before you and then essentially by city council as soon as possible. When that happens, you have a few things that need to be changed through the process, and this would be one of those changes that we'd be looking at making.
What would be the discrepancies or differences between Tool and the DPZ? Each is responsible for what things?
Well, Tool was designed to look more at the roadway, and DPZ was requested to look more at the land uses.
Land use.
Basically, which side of the right-of-way line they fell. But both of them, their philosophies tend to be pretty similar. Their nuances are very different, but their philosophies are very similar. And so they weren't hard to mesh together, but it was the details that you really had to line up.
So what you're trying to do then with this document here is take the best of both, see where the overlaps are, and try to clean up some of this stuff here.
Yeah, and so it was easy for the things that were very specific.
Yeah.
So for the cross sections, that was tool design. That was their job. That was their
Okay, got you.
scope.
Gotcha.
For some of the nodes and the uses and
So none of the cross sections we saw is going to require any taking of land.
correct. Now, I have not gone out there to measure. All I can tell you is that part of the scope that Tool was given was to only include existing right-of-way because nobody was in the mood to purchase additional property.
So when you look at the DPZ ideas, because I know their ideas, you know, trying to get parking off the streets, parking lots behind buildings and things like that. I mean, that's exactly what they did Naples and in Fort Myers and doing the same thing here. I think that's a laudable thing to do, try to get the cars where it's mostly hidden. So we're not going to see anything that's going to be surprising to us, I don't think.
No, I don't think so. I think that once you know, now that we're getting out of the use standards and into some of the more design aspects of it, we do have some changes that we're looking at making from this document that you have. But I think that they all kind of go towards the general consensus that we've heard throughout this process. both from the public comments that we've heard and also from those coming from city council.
As of right now, though, have we gotten, how much public input have we gotten to where as we see this now?
On the specific document, minimal.
Well, this document right here,
Minimal.
minimal so far.
Correct.
So what are we looking at in terms of time to get this through to where we really making this part of our,
I think the first
Plan.
reading goes at the next council meeting next week, and they will probably determine what they want to do with it from a process standpoint after that, whether they just want to take it to the second reading and adopt the ordinance, or whether they want to take a little more time. That's entirely up to them.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, I have
just-
one quick question. When you talk on page 24, number 2A, associated stacking about drive-throughs, are you talking about the queues or the lines?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
And actually, when you start working your way down from that, it gets into lighting. And we are going to better define when bollards are required and when light poles are required. The parking requirement, if you look at number one of the things that we've done in terms of limiting auto-centric uses is to prevent people from building more than 15% of the required parking spaces. And I think that if we kind of limit that to only approved under a special exception, we might be in better shape. Getting on to page 25, we finish up with the parking requirements. And when you look at the first sentence at the top of the page, ratios within urban areas may be reduced using a 3-to-1 ratio. I think we need to specifically exclude handicap spaces from that ratio.
Exclude?
Exclude required handicap spaces from that reduction ratio,
Oh, okay. How are you going to treat them?
just like you would anywhere else. They would not be reduced. And we start getting into parking placement, and I think Mr. Vincent was going into this a little bit, talking about how we're trying to keep the parking areas away from the roadway, kind of behind the buildings. And all this goes to that effort. We're looking at even places where the parking is beside the building, where we're looking at either some sort of opaque screening or a street wall to prevent visibility. We may want to, just as a note, look at maybe a separate standard for the interstate zones for this, because the interstate zones are very distinct from other areas. In fact, they are auto-centric. This is an area that you have the traveling public, and you do expect them and want them there.
As we move a couple of pages forward to page 27, I noticed that in this plan that we have and where the buildings are located, there's no, a few years ago we talked about some kind of a flyover at that point, the congestion that we have at intersection of Tamiami and Beach Road. This plan is not meant to take a look at that sort of thing, is that right?
This plan has some design aspects that come directly out of it. So if you look at the roadways on here, they don't reflect an existing condition. What this means and how we tie proposed development into this plan, we'll have to see what the council directs us to do, whether this is a guide, whether this is something more, I don't know. But this is what DPZ was looking at for the nodes. There are also a couple of other nodes that we need to get into here, but they just didn't, the files didn't transition very well, so we still need to get those cleaned up some.
Page 27 shows the Arroyo connection, both on the north side of Beach Road and on the south side of Beach Road runs.
Correct.
It shows that connection being in place in the future in some form or another, yeah. So there is a design here, if you do it in yellow like I did, that relieves that intersection
Interconnectivity.
somewhat.
I know they're working on that with connecting streets.
Yeah.
And at this point, I would look at this as nothing more than a planning document unless I'm told to look at it otherwise.
Does this process restrict or impede developers from improving the property they have? It kind of worries me sometimes, because I got a 30-year-old building, and I look at it and say, okay, should I remodel it, or should I just tear the thing down and start over again? So
Start over.
if I could do what I wanted to do there, I would probably build a new building. But if I had fell under one of these restrictions,
Your question is a loaded one.
well, it's a real thing because we're not looking at bare land anymore. Everything that we're going to do has got something on it now, probably.
What I think we are experiencing is a transition from a period of time where the city looked at development for the sake of development as generally a good thing. And now the city as land is becoming more scarce, and as time moves on, the standards that they're looking at are going to involve a little more planning. They want things to be designed as part of an overall thought of the city as opposed to designed in a vacuum. And when you're asking me, does that impede development? Well, if my development wants to design in a vacuum and wants to ignore anybody else's standards, then it may. If you're asking me that I've read this document, I understand it, and I want to develop generally consistent with it, does it impede development? The answer is no. So there's more than one answer to it, but what I think you're seeing is the actual question is, why am I looking at this document? And I think that the answer to that is, this city has, and this council has been very specific, that aesthetics and planning, design, especially as it relates to not just the appearance of a building, but the function of a building, from everything from access to stormwater, is much more important to them. And they have asked and required that when someone comes through to ask for zoning approval, or when we're processing development order applications, they want to make sure that we are looking at those standards, and they want us to think, and they want the developers to think. So that's where I see these regulations going, and that's why I see them being created. I don't know if the question, does this impede development, is necessarily the valid question anymore, at least not based upon what I've seen. We are not looking to say no anymore if these are approved than we were 5 to 10 years ago. But the standards for yes are different, and they should be.
Yeah, I mean, you have to have a plan to go forward. You have to have some kind of a plan. Now, this is an example of one way to do it. There are probably other ways to do it. We're only looking at one. You've only been asked to present one, I guess.
There are countless ways to do
Yeah.
it. I'm not going to tell you that this is the only document that would get you there. That's why I
Right.
specifically called out certain sections saying, we've given you one alternative. There are other alternatives if.
So eventually, the council will get to a point where they're making ordinances and rules for those who don't want to lean forward the foxhole, right? Interesting. It's going to be a tough job for them.
They have been consistent so far.
Yeah. So what we're voting on here, as it says on the front page, is that we are just making room by creating new sections that would include what you have here.
Yes, sir. And in fact, once you get to page 33, thank you, Jay, is where from 33 to page 97 is existing language in some form or another that's going to be struck.
We've been down that road, yeah.
Yes, so really there is not new information from 33 to 97.
So we're just voting on making a section available for when the council wants to move forward with this, and then you fill it in.
And there are a couple things that you've proposed that I've taken notes on in terms of making changes, but if there's anything else that you feel should be changed, especially if it relates to comp plan consistency,
Yeah.
we would be happy to hear it.
I think your structure is terrific. I mean, it's a good way to look at it. Break it down into little pieces, and let's look at specifically each piece, because I think it allows landowners to look at the same thing. I don't have to think about everybody else. I'm thinking about this section in here and how I fit in. You know, and so they get very specific rather than reading through, hundreds of pages of rules and regs about what they can do and not do, and all the little nuances with that. Yeah, that's good.
We're able to do that. We've been successful.
Maybe we could just take a minute and run through the rest of the package and see where our questions are. And I don't think I have too many more. I have a lot of pages to go, but I think mine are probably more administrative than they are I mean, I agree with Sam. I like the way you've laid it out, so it's not ambiguous.
And for typos or things, you can just give us handwritten notes and we can make those changes.
Okay, let me just check, make sure that's all they are.
John, I would imagine DPZ and Tool have gone through this as you develop it, or are the final results not yet?
We had conversations with them. Like I said, this has been, it's been years in the making, but the actual draft has been put together relatively quickly. And yes, they will look at it. We have every intention of getting input.
Yeah.
And also, just to share with you, during the moratorium process, and even before the moratorium, we've had the opportunity on those applications that still wanted to move forward to have Tool Design and DPZ be party to those reviews. So Jay and I are kind of well versed in some of the recommendations that they have made, and we've tried to interweave those into that document as well. And then just for the board and the general public, if there's any interest in wanting to look at both the Tool Design study and the DPZ study, they are linked on the community development website. So you go to the community development website and go to the planning studies link, and those two studies are listed there.
Thankfully, though, I think you guys have put together a document that summarizes both of those. A lot easier to do. You can get in the weeds with both of those documents and get tangled up. I mean, I've seen, I mentioned Utopia, but, I say that in jest in a way, in that I've seen a lot of the stuff that DPZ has produced, and it does look good, and I think it is in a good direction, and I think that new urbanism is the newest thing we've seen since the 80s with, planning and zoning. And Miami does it. I don't know how they do it, but I think there's only 300 communities in this country that actually have adopted all of their plan.
Well, DPZ did their code.
In Miami.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So, I think they do have good vision. Things I've seen has been very good in planning.
And you'll see even in the DPZ document, I mean, they kind of wanted to go with the approach of collapsing districts and transects and maybe going with a form-based code. And we still have a hybrid model.
Mm-hmm.
Now, should the city choose at a later date to go ahead with a form-based code model, that's definitely something that's still an option.
Now, they could choose to just take portions of it, right? I mean, you could leave architecture out. You could leave some others out. Say just John last, but yeah, I have my problems with it. But they could go with a partial adoption of any one of those, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
I have another, just really quick, I guess question. 79, page 79. There's a note about solar and wind purposes and about special exception. Just curious, what are you looking at for special exception? I mean, most of the time, are you just looking for, are you just looking for how the solar and wind mitigations are going to be done? Or are you looking at, we don't like them, we're not going to, which I don't think is what you're doing.
So actually, this section is our strike-through section. So, and Jay and I, the next time this goes, before hopefully first reading, we'll go ahead and adequately underline all the new code, and then all the strike-throughs are properly demonstrated. But that note's not new. That's actually an existing regulation, and I'm really not that too familiar with it. But it more so had to deal with if that type of use was to locate on a property, it would allow us the opportunity to see if it would adversely affect surrounding areas because of the size and scale of, if it's a wind turbine or solar panels. So
Does ever that green stuff, I guess, override other stuff?
We do, but a lot of those
Yeah.
things, when you start getting into power generation, is more controlled by the state than it is by the local municipality. We just have certain areas where we can talk about where things are located, but a lot of things are out of our hands.
Yeah, I think they're trying to change that. There are
Sometimes.
people that are out there trying to change that. Okay, one other thing, next page, 80. I just jot number 2, kind of third of the way down the page, development involving manufacturing of following products. I was interested, because you have chemicals and allied products, excluding cosmetics and perfumes, but you don't have anything on pharmaceuticals. And you don't have anything on CBD, although I know you have something elsewhere on CBD. Other drugs,
It is not currently addressed in terms of what you're buying in most of the stores. If you're talking about medical marijuana, those do fall under specific regulations.
okay. All right, so it doesn't need to be here in either one of those pharmaceuticals or,
It may be, but that is not really, you're talking about a separate ordinance, because addressing pharmaceuticals and addressing the Bonita Beach Road overlay are probably not things you can do in one ordinance.
okay. And my other thoughts were cell towers and cable TV dishes, although I don't know that that would be the development, more so than what I'm speaking about is probably the positioning of them.
Where are you, we have a cell tower ordinance.
yeah, that's
Where are
under,
you?
so we.
Yeah, you do have a cell tower ordinance, I know that.
I mean, we didn't make any changes to those regulations, so those regulations would
So that
still
would
apply along
automatically go
forward.
there and not be mentioned here.
Correct.
Okay. Okay, that's all.
One more question here. As we look at the cover sheet here, and we're talking about creating the sections and so forth, and there's one that says establishing criteria for development and redevelopment along the Bonita Beach Road corridor. The criteria specific, it's shown here in uses, right? And setbacks,
Yes, sir.
that sort of
Those
thing.
with- That guides
Okay.
development, location, and
I think we're ready to make a motion.
Yeah, do we need, are there any people in the audience that,
I think so.
that would like to speak on this? Nope, good, all right. Sam?
I'd like to make a motion that we accept the document based on the cover sheet of creating a new section in Article 5, creating a new division of supplementary district regulations, and establishing criteria for development and redevelopment along the Bonita Beach Road corridor, amending Chapter 4, amending Chapter 4 zoning, this whole paragraph here as is. I make a motion to accept the document on that basis.
Yeah, I'll second that motion.
Motion passed. Thank you.
Have a vote?
Oh, this is my first day, so bear with me. I need you to make the roll call.
Rick Sims,
Yes.
Linda Schwartz,
Yes.
Chairwoman Gallagher,
Yes.
Sam Vincent.
Yes.
Okay, now do I say it? Motion passed.
Why don't we take a 5-minute break?
I think that's an excellent idea. All right, 2 down, 1 to go. All right. I am freezing. I mean, thank God I have a jacket. All right, I'll make a quick trip.
I don't mind putting them. Would you rather want to do the changes, or do you want to do a memo?
No, you're doing a
Would you want to make the changes in the document, or do you want to make
struggle
write a
with
memo?